afternoon, everyone. We're delighted so many of you could join us today for our launch of this report, as well as members of the media. So welcome to CDE Virtual. What we're going to do is I'm going to do a presentation for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to open it up for questions and discussion with my partners in this project, who I will introduce to you in a moment. So let me start to share my screen. Okay. Can everyone see the screen? The pictures? Lydia, am I visible? Okay. This is a report we're going to be presenting on a new approach to housing and urban development in the country. It's the product of three organizations, Shisaka, led by Matthew Nell, one of the country's leading housing experts, and Tough, which is led by Paul Jackson, one of the leading exponents and funders of what we're going to be talking about today: small entrepreneurs, sometimes medium-sized, reconfiguring our cities throughout the country. And CDE, which I represent, which has long argued for building cities of hope as a key component of an inclusive growth strategy. So what are the headlines of what we're going to be saying today? We want to think differently about housing for poorer people. We're going to identify an area of enormous opportunity for the country. We'll explain the concept of massive small and the local entrepreneurs driving it in our cities. I'll talk about the challenges faced by small developers and our metropolitan governments. And then we'll end with recommendations on how to manage urban densification well. So let's turn to how we want you to think differently about housing for poorer people. Ricardo Hausman will be familiar to some of you. He is a Harvard professor, probably one of the leading experts on national development, economic development in the developing world. And a few years ago, he wrote an article about habitats, not houses. And we think this is really apt for South Africa. So he argues that a house, a housing unit, is an object. A habitat is a node in a multiplicity of overlapping networks. Networks of power, water, sanitation, roads, transport, labor markets, shops, schools, religious institutions, community halls, health clinics, and so on. And he says that if the housing deficit is measured as one of houses alone, not connected habitats, the solution often does not solve the real problem. In his view, this approach in many countries artificially creates segregated poor neighborhoods where unskilled people live among themselves, disconnected from others, making it much harder for them to benefit from connected, dynamic city economies. So if you think of South Africa as an urbanizing society, we are nearly 70% urbanized already, and this will increase. We need to think about cities and housing for the poor. This is a relationship we don't think about nearly enough. And the critical issue is scale delivery, but it's also location and connectivity, access to economic opportunity and infrastructure. And it's how we stimulate local economic development. Here's another relationship South Africans don't think about enough, in our view: housing and unemployment. South Africa's unemployment crisis pre-COVID was the deepest in the world. We released a major report in January, which we called 10 million people unemployed and rising. With COVID now, we probably have lost anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5 million jobs. So we're near to 13 million people unemployed. And the best way to think about that is that in most countries, around 60% of the workforce has a job. In South Africa today, 38% of our workforce is employed. This is a catastrophic situation. So you have to think about cities as labor markets, the places where you connect people to work opportunities. And this is difficult in South Africa when 14% of South Africans spend more than 2 hours traveling between home and work every day. And 20% of households spend around 30% of their income on transport. So densification and moving people closer to work opportunities has to be part of how we deal with unemployment. Now, what are the housing options in South Africa today? In picture number 1, you will see the dominant form of housing for the poor is RDP housing, often in remote areas on cheap but extensive land. So sprawling settlements, but often far away from economic opportunity. The second picture shows the other very prominent kind of housing in the country, which is informal settlements, also predominantly on the edges of our cities, where poor people build their own structures, most often on land they do not own. Now, if you look at pictures 3 and 4, you will see that closer to the cities, people are constructing denser buildings in townships and in suburbs of varying quality, some formal, some informal. So if you start to unpack the housing challenge, we have RDP houses, possibly 3.5 to 4 million. This is a big achievement of our democratic government. And it's impressive compared to many other developing countries. And it is a big achievement, but there's some problems. Firstly, the location, as I've said, far away from economic opportunity in most cases. And then we have the problem that the deeds office is not working well. And around 60% of all homeowners in the country do not have access to registered tenure and are not able to process housing transactions through the formal deeds registry system. The other big area of housing are the informal settlements, which we have around 3,000 throughout the country, involving some 23% of South Africans, well over 12 million people. The only solution to this is to upgrade these settlements. And unless they're on land that will endanger communities, this is the solution in most cases. And you have to let the community lead in how to do that with support from the authorities, a big topic. Now, if you project the housing need 25 years ahead in the 8 metros, we will need some 9.5 million units, more than double all of our existing households. So how do we do that? Our current approach to housing is focused on what you could call RDP greenfields, but this is not a viable approach. We're already struggling to find land to meet even the current need for housing, never mind the future need. And the land required over the next 25 years would be greater than the current size of the entire Johannesburg metro area, around 300,000 hectares. Now, the RDP policy provides for a subsidy for each adult individual for a housing. This is an enormous amount of money. And we calculate that if about 70% of future need from today for the next 25 years, about 70% of those people will need subsidies, you're talking about 2.3 trillion rand in today's numbers. I don't have to mention the country's dire fiscal situation, which will be with us for quite a long time. We can't afford this anymore. But in addition to the subsidies, think about the sprawling cities that we're going to create and the enormous transport and environmental and other costs that will be incurred through this, not to mention infrastructure that has to stretch over such vast distances. So we will put the financial viability of our metros at risk if we continue with this kind of approach. And of course, the peripheral location of most of these greenfields, the vast majority, will exacerbate poverty and joblessness. Now, part of the alternative that we're going to put forward today is already underway. And that's going to be the focus of the rest of my presentation. I should just say that the slogan of many an election in our democracy has been free housing for all. But this, in our view, is no longer a workable option. So let's turn to one part of the alternatives. We think there's an area of enormous housing opportunity in South Africa's cities. If you look at the metros, we have 4.5 million detached, privately owned houses today. And we're seeing homeowners and small developers building rental accommodation on these existing properties. And this phenomenon is widespread and growing throughout urban South Africa. Now, even on conservative assumptions, the potential for densification in our cities is huge. There are a lot of benefits from densification. It will reduce the requirement for land over the next 25 years. We estimate some 70%. It will create more efficient, productive, inclusive cities. And it provides opportunities for poorer people in well-located areas. Now, there's a success story in South Africa which isn't talked about much. We are seeing a changing demographic profile and use of our inner cities. We're also seeing many new entrepreneurs in different kinds of activities and predominantly Black entrepreneurs. The developments that are taking place in this residential densification are commercially viable and they don't require subsidies. And we're arguing that we should support this dynamic urban development, not through subsidies to individuals, but through technical and funding support to our municipalities. Look at the Johannesburg City Centre, which is a bustling entrepreneurial zone. Obviously pre-COVID, all our statistics, but I'm sure we will get there again. So we have informal sector employment, which grew by 210% in the last 5 years. 3,000 city centre shops, which pull in 10 billion rand annually from cross-border shoppers. And this is double the annual turnover of Sandton City. So it's not insignificant. And then you have transport nodes already in the city, which intersect with economic hubs. In addition to that, we have surrounding in-city or inner suburbs. These suburbs provide affordable, available opportunities within easy reach of the city centre. And I'm talking in Johannesburg of places like Yeoville, Troyville, or Melbourne. In Cape Town, suburbs like Delft or Dunoon or Grassy Park or Khayelitsha. Now, of course, there is some urban distress, but generally you can get affordable mortgages and available land in these suburbs. They're close to bus routes and their own local economic activity. There's infrastructure already built, often underutilized, and there's affordable schooling. Many of these places, not all, but many are close to the city centre. This, for example, is Harley Street in Yeoville, which runs down into Joe Slovo Drive, and Hillbrow, which is 10 minutes walk away. So we're going to introduce you to this concept of massive small and the local entrepreneurs driving it in our cities. What is this massive small? Now, we didn't invent this concept, I should immediately stress, but it's an idea that certainly Tough has been promoting for many years now. Essentially, you can define it like this. Massive small development uses local knowledge, local infrastructure. It responds to deep demand for well-located housing in ways that promote local economies. So what you're seeing are new entrepreneurs constructing multiple rental units in and around city centres. These are dwellings, often in backyards, or they refurbish rental units in inner suburbs and city centres. And a typical example could be a 2 to 3 story walk-up in the backyard of a subdivided house. So these are small developers in the main. There are some medium-sized ones and small developments. But if we get lots and lots of people doing this, we can get to enormous scale. So let me tell you some stories. This is a picture of Hillbrow. And if you look on the first picture, you'll see a low-level building. And this is a building that Caesar Kelly, a young property entrepreneur, acquired in the heart of Hillbrow. It was originally in dreadful condition with rubbish filling its passages and exposed live electrical cables. She transformed this, the next picture and the next, into 29 smart units for rental, about, depending on size, 1,300 to 2,500 per unit. Here's Yeoville. This is the house actually that the minister in charge of housing, Lindiwe Sisulu, once owned, and she sold this house to Sibusiso, a civil servant. It's on St. George's Street, if you know Yeoville at all. Now, Sibusiso turned this house into 7 single-room units for rent. He then got a loan to build 8 bachelor units in the back at rentals between 1,500 and 2,500 a month. And you can see that in the second picture. Shared ablution facilities, shared kitchen facilities. Now, Sibusiso has since reinvested his profits in other buildings in Soweto and other parts of Yeoville. Here we have Cape Town, and we're seeing a very different kind of urban environment, some ambitious projects in some areas with real potential. So Dunoon on the left and Delft on the right are well-located townships or suburbs situated near areas of economic activity and with reasonably good transport into the city. So Delft on the left is near the airport and close to thriving industrial zones in that area. Dunoon, am I getting confused? Dunoon on the right is close to jobs and economic opportunities in neighboring Killarney Gardens and Montague Gardens, the residential areas of Bloberg and Milnerton, as well as surrounding farms and mining activity. So the building in the second picture, a double story, was developed by a woman called Zama as a way to help her 65-year-old mother who wasn't able to access her pension, her state pension. Zama approached a finance company called Bitprop for assistance in developing the rental units. Together with Bitprop, they developed 4 rental units on the property, which has provided Zama's mother with an income that's significantly higher than what she would have received from a state-provided pension. Now, what are the benefits of this kind of massive small development that is already taking place? Firstly, you get development and employment benefits. People are creating well-located housing, habitats in Ricardo Hausman's sense, connected to opportunity, to transport, to the sort of in-city of our metropolitan areas. They're getting access to jobs and opportunities, and in the process, they're promoting small business activity of many different kinds. What about funding? Well, it's important to stress these are viable projects generating profits and income, and they don't rely on government help. The metro government is also benefiting because this densification enhances the fiscal sustainability of the metro through rates and services payments, and also it supports investment in the expansion and renewal of urban infrastructure. Let me give you one example. As I mentioned, TUF is a CDE's partner in the report we've produced and is with us tonight. They're one of the leading exponents and funders of Massive Small, who've really certainly helped CDE understand what is happening already and what is possible. They like to describe themselves as a funder that is making a profit and making a difference. 17 years operation within all 8 metros. They finance upgrading, refurbishing, and building of rental units in and around inner cities. Here are the numbers in terms of what they've achieved. 4.7 billion in funding to 350 entrepreneurs, current loan book 3.7 billion, generated 40,000 housing units, and they funded by a range of public but mainly private institutions. Loans can range between 1 million to 40 million, and they've also established 2 unusual funds within the group. So Intutuko Equity Fund supports potential entrepreneurs who have never owned investment property before, and it helps them to enter into the residential property market, the fund acting as the partner for the entrepreneur by contributing to the deposit amount. A new innovation is Umastandi Township Fund, which is designed to help finance rental units in the backyard of township houses. And Umastandi provides finance and training to develop an existing township property through building formal approved and quality residential stock. Now, tough could be much bigger if it got more support. There's some new financial innovations starting to emerge over the last 2 to 3 years to operate in this market. So the picture on the left is something that an organization called Indlu, sort of app-based organization, helped to build. They provide funding for upgrades and new formal developments. The borrowers don't need collateral, but they enter into a share agreement with Indlu. In return for funding, Indlu receives 90% of the rent from the rental units for a period of 5 years to repay the loan. The middle picture here is another innovative organization called Bitprop. This is a new company that partners with homeowners to secure title deeds and then designs and constructs bachelor-style units for rent. Bitprop takes on the risk of the capital outlay and in return demands a portion of the tenant income for some 10 years or until the cost of construction is repaid. The third photograph is iBuild. And iBuild Home Loans was launched 3 years ago, and they have offices in townships across the country. They provide lending solutions for low-income workers, typically rejected by banks. The applicant must have a title deed and earn a minimum joint income of 5,500 per month. The loans they offer start at 60,000 Rand. The loans iBuild offers start at 60,000 Rand, which is much lower than most banks would even begin to consider. What are the challenges faced by these small developers? Well, first we have to start with the bureaucracy, what the president likes to call red tape. South African metros require an 11-step process to obtain valid building permits. These take an average of 125 days to complete. Many small builders find it impossible to comply. The process in South Africa requires nearly 6 more procedures and is nearly 40% more expensive than the average for OECD countries, most of which are much more developed than this country. So what holds massive small back? The metros lack capacity and processes to manage this kind of development and increased urban density. Compliance today adds up to 20% to development costs, and delays by officials can add up to 80% to project duration. The developer often decides to just go ahead regardless. This is not good. In terms of finance, developers struggle to access long-term developmental finance and often get too little money, so they have to raise it all incrementally, and this leads to delays as well. Let me turn then to our recommendations. What we need in South Africa are cities of hope, cities of inclusion, cities of connection for poor people. We need vibrant, well-managed, low-income neighborhoods. What we don't need are inner city slums with poor quality housing and urban decay and worse. So this is a massive opportunity for the country, but we have to manage it appropriately and effectively in all our metros and cities. And that means, in short, you've got to expand infrastructure and you've got to encourage reasonable quality housing. And you've got to empower municipalities to do that. So let me turn then to our recommendations, where we're going to look at metros, at the national government and business. So we're arguing that the metros need to focus on areas for residential densification. There's some areas that have been rezoned already, and it's important to rezone more, get ahead of the game so that this can happen faster and more effectively. The metros need appropriate compliance rules and processes. This is not some enormous construction company. These are individuals or very small firms. And part of this is we need off-the-shelf planning options to just shorten this whole process and make it more appropriate. The metros have to expand the infrastructure for a denser city. We need engineering and social infrastructure, bulk infrastructure, and we need service connection fees. And all of this requires strengthening urban management capacity for this kind of new city in South Africa and new activity, or expanded activity, because it's already happening. What about national government? We're saying that the national government needs to appreciate what's happening and promote an approach that's relevant for developing world cities. We've got to ensure norms and standards do not undermine this dynamic market of massive small development. We should move away from housing subsidies to individuals. We don't want that to be transferred into the massive small market. It would interfere with what is happening already. And then we need direct funding, some more support from the national government to municipalities to help them deal with higher levels of densification. It's technical support, it's financial support in terms of infrastructure, and we are proposing a new conditional grant to metros to fund free service connections and waive development contributions. What can business do? Well, first we need a much greater awareness of the densification that is already taking place through small and viable entrepreneurs. So we want to direct more commercial funding and support for existing specialist lenders like TUF and others. South Africa's fantastic financial institutions need to apply their brainpower and get some further innovation in financial products for this market. And then they too can encourage entrepreneurs and innovative app developers and others to enter this market. This is a big market and it can get a lot bigger, and South Africa needs it to get bigger. So let me pull this together. We're arguing for a housing policy that manages and promotes densification, and that this would have significant positive consequences. It would help connect people to economic opportunities. It would overcome some of the real constraints the current RDP-focused approach confronts. It would provide affordable housing in well-located areas. It promotes Black entrepreneurship, and it stimulates inclusive growth through local economic development. Now, the important point here is this doesn't require a massive increase in government spending, and nor does it require radical land policies. In fact, no new regulation or legislation is required. Let me conclude RDP developments have tended to reinforce apartheid patterns, forcing poor people into peripheral locations. The spatial legacy of apartheid is starting to break down, but we can accelerate this. We must accelerate this, and then we must manage it as effectively as possible. We need to support small entrepreneurs reconfiguring our cities to respond to real demand. We want less top-down government planning and more room for households and small developers, small entrepreneurs to build their own well-connected housing, mainly for rental, in well-managed neighborhoods that make economic sense. In short, we want urban development that gives people access to all the opportunities and connections that I'm sure most of the people on this call take for granted. Let me end with one more slide. CDE's chairman, Laurie Dippenaar, likes to encourage us to take years of work, mountains of research papers, and reduce it all to soundbites or t-shirt slogans. And we've managed to do that on this topic. So our first one is habitats, well-connected habitats, not housing units. We've got to think about cities as labor markets. What we want are vibrant, developing neighborhoods, not inner city slums. And then lastly, ownership of housing has had a complicated history in South Africa. I was a part of the Urban Foundation, which were the first people to provide 99-year leaseholds in apartheid South Africa for urban Black South Africans to establish their rights to the city. And this was a form of ownership that had never been possible before. And you couldn't get money for it in South Africa. They had to go to New York to get special funding from New York banks for this. And over the years, ownership has become the dominant approach to how we deal with housing in South Africa. And obviously, ownership should always be available to everyone. But the truth is, if you're a poorer South African and you're unemployed, location trumps ownership. And it's far better to rent in well-connected Orange Grove than to own a unit in isolated, far away Orange Farm. Thanks very much. That's the end of the presentation. I'm going to stop sharing. And I'm now going to call on my partners, Matthew Nell and Paul Jackson, and we'll start responding to some of the questions. Perhaps, Matthew, would you like to come in and say something or respond to a question that you've seen while I have a chance to look through? Or Paul, one or the other? Let me find some questions.
After you, Matthew.
I'm busy reading the questions.
Yeah.
Being caught off guard.
I think the one thing that I would like to add, Anne, is that we have to look at the fiscal impact of urban densification. Promoting local economic development, investing in value downtown and in in-city areas, in fact, improves the rate space spoken about generally. It improves consumption and payment for municipal services. It increases the value of land. Nowhere has this been more dramatically seen than in the city of Johannesburg, that sort of towards the end of the 90s, early 2000s, the rate space was, and the value of property downtown was decimated, I guess, and it wasn't contributing a lot And with the investment in inner city areas, with lots of investment of small and medium-sized entrepreneurs, this rate space has increased a lot. So there is this whole concept of a fiscal impact. And the fiscal impact works both ways. One is more money coming into the coffers, but through urban densification, you're not having to service this increasing urban sprawl and all the new administrative and other infrastructures that go with it. Would be my only addition.
Matthew, perhaps?
I'll comment to one. There was a question asked, isn't the quality of the stock within the inner cities in such a bad condition that it cannot be upgraded? So let me comment on that. First of all, cities go through a process of decline and renewal. And the process of decline and renewal creates opportunities for different demographic groups to get a foothold in the cities. So in the 90s, there was a huge opportunity for low-income people to move into mainly rental accommodation in the inner cities of the cities, of our cities in Johannesburg, in Cape Town, in fact, in all of the metros. And that created an opportunity for those areas to upgrade. The very fact that the stock had declined in value made that possible. Similarly, we have declines in value in some of the inner suburbs around, for example, Johannesburg. The very fact that that decline in value is happening makes it possible and viable to acquire those properties and to convert them into denser residential developments. Similarly, there is going to be a fairly significant opportunity emerging as COVID changes people's work at home patterns, and lots and lots of excess office space starts becoming available for conversion into residential. So this dynamic market is what feeds this opportunity. And it's the entrepreneurs that do the numbers and see that opportunity, acquire the property, invest in it, and start generating income in it, that is turning those areas of decline into upwardly developing areas.
So Matthew and Paul, perhaps you could respond to the first question, which is, what are the other challenges preventing vertical consolidation in South African townships? Why do these areas sprawl horizontally as opposed to vertically as seen in other countries? Is increased capital or lending a magic bullet to solve this?
Paul, you want to go first?
Paul, do you want to come in?
I mean, that's a very good question, and I didn't answer it live because I think Mohammed was put his finger on the button. I mean, of course, liquidity. Markets can't function in the absence of liquidity. And I always remember in the early days of housing policy, there was this concept of how wide and how deep. And how wide was, how do we produce as many houses at lowest cost to the budget in terms of just the housing budget. And the depth was really about spending more to get people closer to work. And I think that if you take a sort of broader view of what's the overall impact, and you add that together with liquidity, you would promote this. And liquidity is really part of if you think about the market failure in these areas, the absence of title deeds, the problems concerning perfection of security and all those kind of things, it certainly is. It's not the magic bullet, but it's one of the necessary conditions to achieve this. And I think that the balance of this is really about policy. Now, if you look at policy of every one of the metros and most of the provincial departments of housing, but sticking with the metros, they all talk to this concept of the importance of combating urban sprawl through urban densification, through the use of existing infrastructure. So I imagine it's there's no magic bullet, but liquidity is one of them. Access to finance, spoken about more generally, and then also the importance of policy and an enabling government who is actively promoting urban densification.
And let me add to that, please.
Yes, please go ahead.
So I think the other thing is we must be realistic in what we talk about when we talk about vertical densification, because there's this kind of romantic notion that vertical densification is synonymous with Singapore. This is not the case. In fact, for me, the densification we're talking about in South Africa is more synonymous with the 2- and 3-story walk-ups that make up the bulk of New York City and London. Those are the types of densifications we're looking for, not multi-rise buildings. In fact, in New York, the high-rise residential stuff is mainly government projects, which have been stupendously unsuccessful, or otherwise very, very high-income luxury apartments. So the norm for the middle-income family is to be part of a 2- or 3-story walk-up in a residential area. And that will happen in places like Soweto or Mayfair when it becomes a financially viable proposition to add the extra units onto your property, because there's sufficient demand and willingness to pay for that rent to make that an investment opportunity. And we're seeing that switch happening in the last couple of years. The massive switch from just putting up a single-story backyard dwelling to going to a 2- or 3-story walk-up of rental rooms or small flats is because those economic conditions are switching.
Perhaps I can add something, just skimming through this is quite difficult, through the questions we're getting. We're not saying this is the only way to deal with South Africa's housing challenge, and I think that's important. We're saying that we have enormous numbers of informal settlements and these should be upgraded. That's a conversation for another day. We're in favor of upgrading informal settlements, and South Africa should be much more active and involved in getting this to happen than we have been. We're also not saying that there should be no RDP developments at all. We're saying the shift should be towards this kind of housing, which is taking place already, and that we need to, we see enormous opportunity if it is well supported along the lines we've suggested, for it to go to really big scale. And it is so much more desirable than being far away and using what little money you have to use to get into the city, to get to a job interview, rather than being closer to economic opportunity. So it's a very broad statement, but that's what we're trying to say. This is one part, and we think it could be a really big part of how South Africa deals with the enormous need for well-located housing. Now, just getting a rental unit in Yeoville doesn't mean this is the total answer to local economic development or unemployment. Far from it. But it means you've got a much better chance, and that this kind of development will be supportive of more jobs in the local area and of access to all sorts of other opportunities, whether it's getting more skills or other kinds of opportunities, or working for one of these developers. But this doesn't solve South Africa's unemployment challenge. And it doesn't solve all our urban challenges either. We're just saying, here's this big opportunity and it's happening already. We've got to make sure it happens to the maximum it can, and that it's well managed so that it doesn't create inner city slums, but rather the kind of habitats and connections and vibrant neighborhoods that we need to both integrate our cities more and to give poorer people a chance.
And there's an interesting set of questions in the middle of the questions. And if you don't mind, I'd like to pick up on some of them. Francois Verily, who famously coined the 40 by 40 by 40 adage in respect of our housing development, 40 square meters, 40 kilometers away, where you're spending 40% of your income on transport and 40% of the people are unemployed, and so you can carry on. Ask the question is, do you need demand side incentives? And I think the short answer is no, you don't. Well, not for now, because the demand to live in inner cities, in our experience, or in city, is enormous. And there is an idea that people who come to the city generally have a much, I mean, the research points this out, the point that Anne has just made, that the research points out that people have much more opportunity to either create a business or to find work. Alistair Anderson then asked the question, is there enough support for young Black property entrepreneurs? And at one level, this is an important question because you're talking about urban land reform. You're talking about changing the complexion of ownership. You're talking about wealth creation. And Alistair, the short answer is that there is, if you think about support for Black property entrepreneurs, you talk about senior debt funding at normal commercial rates, and then you talk about the importance of the equity contribution, helping with the deposit, what the Intertuga Equity Fund is about. Now, there is no source of equity support for Black property entrepreneurs in South Africa today. And there hasn't been for the last 10 years. There's always an exception to the rule, and that's the Gauteng Partnership Fund that has been providing that kind of support. But outside that, whether you go to the National Empowerment Fund, you go to the Ministry of Human Settlements, this is a big area where we've got to start developing that sort of market-based but assisted land reform kind of approach that was in fact part of our agricultural land reform policy in the earlier days before it shifted to something different.
Matthew, can I ask you to there's a question about how to deal with NIMBYism, not in my backyard kind of attitudes, and how do you think one deals with that in South Africa's cities?
Thanks for that, Anne.
Anytime.
NIMBYism is something that will be with us wherever there's change. So whenever there's a change in housing use, demography, format, there will be a resistance. Now, whether this is subdividing properties in Constantia and Houston, or in converting residential houses in Orange Gome into rooms and building additional rental in those areas. The people who live in that area and have lived there for years, and the people who live in the surrounding suburbs will go through distress as they deal with the fact that their market is changing around them. So I think the idea that NIMBYism goes away is incorrect. It's a manifestation of change and the process of it. I think the big difference is when it's being applied at a political scale or at an individual development scale. So when you are upgrading an informal settlement as a big informal settlement proximate to middle and upper income residential areas, the government becomes the target for the NIMBYism. When you have massive small and hundreds or thousands and thousands of entrepreneurs moving into opportunities in the housing market, acquiring properties and converting them to a much denser residential use, it really does not become significant because it's no longer a political process. It's a process of normal dis-ease with change. So I think that's the point I really want to make here. It's not, whenever there's a change in land use, whether it's putting in a new shopping center or whether it's densifying the area, there will be those people people who believe it's not in their interest for that to happen, and others who believe it is in their interest. This is normal. It's not something that you avoid. It's something you've just got to recognize takes place. I just want to add one other thing, if I might, Anne, and that was, there was a question that raised that we're talking here about supply side support, and what are we doing about demand side support. And what that means is we're talking about technical support and reducing the cost of developments for developers by providing free service connections, waiving development contributions, appropriate standards, and so on. But what are we doing about poor people's ability to afford rent? And I think that's a very valid question. And it's important to note that this type of delivery is currently delivering the cheapest rental accommodation in the housing market. So backyard rooms in some of the areas like Soweto start at 600-700 Rand a month. And if you start talking about formal small flats, you might be paying 1,500 to 2,000 Rand a month. It's very hard to see where either social housing or privately developed corporate multi-story housing can compete with those kind of prices. So in the first instance, the market is supplying on an affordable basis and is very, very responsive to demand. It's very, very responsive to the fact that they need to keep their rooms full and their accommodation full in order to get their returns. At the same time, there is lots of room for those prices to come down. Again, let me remind you that the in-lieu financing model pays for the loan or the funding to develop those units over 5 years. When we talk about a normal investment, we look at a 10 to 15 to 20 year repayment period. What that means is there's a lot of space. As supply increases and as landlords are trying to fill their spaces for those rentals to come down. What we've got to be very careful of is that we don't get end user subsidies coming into this market and gumming up the ability for people to supply at scale. So I would say demand side interventions for this end of the market should be avoided. But what you should do is you should be continuing to reduce the cost of development to the micro developers so that their ability to reduce rents as more and more supply comes into the market is increased.
Thanks, Matthew. Can I make a general point? Because I think there are lots of fantastic questions coming through, and some of them, I think the three of us have answers to, and some of them raise broader issues. South Africa doesn't spend enough time thinking about its cities, and our future is going to be determined in our cities. And how we do this and how we manage some of these difficult transitions that Matthew's talking about is really important. We've done a lot of thinking about growth coalitions in cities. And I've often thought that one way to deal with the NIMBYism problem is to involve the people from the richer suburbs and leadership from those suburbs in thinking about the future of the city for the next 20 years and what kind of city they want to live in and what is realistic for South Africa. And you then get them, it's not just a city council problem, but it's a leadership challenge for the city and people with different stakes in that city. And then it's not just, if you like, oh dear, what are we going to do about the poor? But it's how do we build a city that has room for everybody in it, and what are the techniques that we can use to do that? So I think there's some very important issues being raised here, from that kind of big issue all the way to, I liked Andrew Donaldson's comment about, for example, you know, in a more dense urban environment, you can have shops on the ground floor and you can live above that, which is what happens in many other cities around the world. And we don't have that in many cases, although it's starting to appear. So Paul's going to disagree with me that we're starting to see spaza shops and things like that and people living on the same property. I agree with you. It's going to work a lot better in a more dense environment. But there are lots of big issues that what we're talking about start to raise, because we're talking about the future of South Africa and urban South Africa. And I don't think we spend enough time talking about all this complexity and the many policy issues that we need answers to. And we certainly don't have answers to all of them tonight. Paul, do you want to come in?
No, I think I'd like to just add 2 points to that, is that we really need to promote mixed use, mixed income areas. And I think Massive Small's about that. You know, it's not housing. There's a lot of research to say that a certain amount of urban densification promotes economic and social action. And we're certainly seeing that. And we very seldom see people just building housing in a particular area, but we're seeing that sort of multi-use thing come through. I think the second thing is, and I'm always amazed, one of the biggest problems that Tough has faced in its history is convincing people about the belief of the ordinary person. There are entrepreneurs and the power of local knowledge. There are entrepreneurs in many of the areas that we finance that with the right access to financing, use that local knowledge and their entrepreneurial skill to develop an enormous amount of economic activity, whether it be housing, etc. And I do want to just flag that belief in local knowledge and the ordinary person contributing to these sort of mixed income, mixed use neighborhoods. And then it's amazing how quickly, I mean, I see one of the NIMBYism, Nick Botha says that talks about the corridors of freedom here in Johannesburg. Let me just put the caveat. Johannesburg's got world-class plans, but it's a very badly run city. Durban, on the other hand, is a much better run city, but it's got no plan at all. It's very difficult to find out what's going on in the various areas. But taking the corridors of freedom as an example, it's amazing how the development starting to happen around the Ria Vaya routes, you know, that sort of the importance of I mean, getting back to the central theme, the importance of metros implementing against their plans in a kind of transparent way, and entrepreneurs will come, and there are a lot of them, and there's enormous opportunity.
Matthew, perhaps you could talk a bit. One of the questions is about, you know, Dunoon and Delft are townships, and what are we saying about upgrading these areas? We're seeing upgrading, but can you just talk a bit about, you know, the difference between a Yeovil, say, and a township like Dunoon or Delft?
Look, I think there is in South Africa still a differentiation between suburbs and townships. And the differentiator is not only historic, but it's also a reflection of the level of infrastructure, both social and commercial, that exist in those areas. And this is a lot to do with the history and the lack of investment that happened in the early days. While lots of investment is going in there at the moment, it still is behind the curve in terms of the level of economic activity and the proximity to economic activity in most suburbs. And this is another reason why we should move away from just densifying townships and looking at densifying, quite frankly, every residential area in a metro should be densified. South African cities are the lowest density cities in the world, only competing with another centrally planned nation called Russia. It's only those two countries that have got very low density cities. So there's massive room in high, middle, and low income areas to densify the areas. This does not resolve the overall development of the economy. It does not resolve the overall investment in social and commercial infrastructure, that would happen, but density certainly makes it more justifiable to make those investments. Let me give you an example on engineering infrastructure. Someone raised the question, you're going to require massive infrastructure re-engineering and spending to accommodate the densification of the cities. This is true, but if I've got a limited number of rands to spend on infrastructure, surely you would prefer to enhance the infrastructure that exists and expand its capacity and upgrade it and renew it, than to put infrastructure on the periphery, very expensive infrastructure on the periphery to accommodate low density development. So this is not a silver bullet. What this is, if I can describe it, this is a bullet that's actually flying at us. It's happening. This is not a choice about whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. The only choice we have is the extent to which we embrace it and enable it to be a positive contributor to the building of our cities, where compliant, stable, good quality accommodation is being provided, as opposed to allowing it to happen on a non-compliant basis because we haven't got our act together to support the investment and to manage from an urban management point of view. So it doesn't solve all the problems of urban development. It's a major contributor, and the consequences of not embracing it are massive.
I would say Jill Strelitz makes an important point, another housing expert, who says that, we'll be able to manage the fears about NIMBYism and NIMBYism itself much better if we're managing these developments better. So there is a relationship here that I think is really important. Urban management capacity, recognizing this, what's happening already, its potential and its dangers, is absolutely vital to manage this forward in the best possible way. There's one question I will answer about what we're going to do with this and what influence we may or may not have. I'll hold that for last. Paul, is there a few points you want to make, any issues before we close? And then I'll ask Matthew for any final comments, and then I'll make a final comment. Paul.
2 points really. One is that what this is targeted at is, think of massive small as 10,000 average 20-unit projects per annum. That's the kind of massive that we'd be looking at, and there's a lot of opportunity, and there are a lot of financial institutions already involved, but it could be extended. The second is a point that Rob McGaffin makes. The technical assistance to the city should include research and data and trends and demands and those kind of things, because without that, it's going to be much more difficult for the real economy to open up through investment by larger institutions, more formal institutions, supporting and supplementing all the work of the non-bank financial services companies such as Tough and others, and the sort of broad range iBuild, Inlu, etc., all of which are increasingly making a big contribution. So the importance of data and research, I think Rob McGaffin is a very, very important one, and we have a woeful lack of investment in this important sort of applied research and the data side of things. Thank you, Anne.
Thanks, Paul. Matthew, final comments, issues you want to?
Yeah, two points. You mentioned earlier on the fact that this is a focus on rental, and I think that's correct for now. But I think it's important to understand that tenure and the tenure that's offered in different types of units changes over time. So let me remind everyone that Hillbrow was developed as multi-story residential rental. In the 60s and 70s, it significantly converted to sectional title and provided ownership. And in the 80s and 90s, it became mainly rental again. So this, and the same thing happens in different places. So we mustn't get too hung up about whether we're delivering rental accommodation or ownership accommodation. When there is significant stock and there's significant demand for ownership of that stock, there will be a methodology for creating opportunities for owning some of that stock. The second point I wanted to make is some questions came up. To what extent are building standards a barrier to this type of development? By and large, I haven't met any micro developers who wouldn't rather be compliant when they're investing their hard-earned money in a development which is going to be yielding income to them in the long term. So I don't think that the actual building standards themselves are a fundamental problem. What is a fundamental problem is the way in which cities administer these standards, whether these are land use standards and rules or building standards and development control. So when the cities make it more possible for people to meet the compliance requirements because there is a reasonable process for making application and securing approvals or avoiding to have to make applications in certain states, we will remove the barrier. The barrier is not the standards. The barrier is the way in which the cities administer the standards. So we really do need the city to change their business processes and systems to accommodate this type of development. Otherwise, again, we're encouraging non-compliance and bad outcomes.
Great, thanks very much. I want to make 2 points before we close. The one is CDE's been running in a series of workshops and Zoom webinars on the informal sector, and we're trying to learn more about it and grapple with how to think about beyond just the words, we want more small business, we want more micro entrepreneurs in the country. And I often think that they're hidden entrepreneurs. So all these entrepreneurs helping to rebuild the cities are entrepreneurs we don't normally hear from. They're not represented. We don't know what their problems are unless you do specific research on it, as Tough is doing. But these are entrepreneurs who are not expecting anything from anyone. They just want space to get on with it. And that's partly what we're saying. And this is a very different kind of entrepreneur from the sort of tenderpreneur that has developed in South Africa, unfortunately, over the last sort of decade. So I think it's important when we talk about entrepreneurs in South Africa to understand that these kinds of people who are finding spaces and niches to build things and to build their businesses, as opposed to other kinds of entrepreneurs, because I think we use this word entrepreneur very loosely. So that's just one point. The second is there were a few questions about how are we going to use this material to influence the powers that be? Well, today is the first time we're going public with the report, the executive summary, this event, and we hope the media will write about it. So we're trying to get much more knowledge about this bullet Matthew talks about, this phenomenon taking place in our cities, which we need to know about and think hard how to respond to. And we've made suggestions on how to do that. So we will be sending this report to some 15,000 decision makers tomorrow morning. And we know there were a number of people from national government and metros who were on the call today. And we're writing some articles which you'll see in the papers over the next few weeks. So this is the beginning of CDE sort of kind of trying to add its voice to popularize what's going on, and that it's really important how we respond to this positive development, inevitable development in the right way to make it work for everybody and for the cities. So I think there are people who will be listening. There's one metro that has started to move in the direction we're suggesting already, and that's very encouraging and important. And I'm sure there will be others. So we really would ask you to share this information and knowledge you've gleaned from this webinar with your organization, with your government department, with your bank or financial institution. And the more we can get people talking about this, I think the more good ideas will emerge, and we'll be able to respond to this in as positive a way as possible. So I think with those words, I'm going to thank everybody for joining us today. We really were very encouraged to get such a big audience, and we will be distributing all the documents. I think the links are all on the chat line or the Q&A, and you can go to our website. Everything should be up there now. And please spread the word and talk about how South Africa responds to this, and much more attention on our cities and how we connect people and get housing as part of the weave of our urban environments in a way that promotes local economic development, entrepreneurship, and employment. Thank you very much to everybody, and a special thank you to Matthew and to Paul for working with CDE on this. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you, Anne.
Pleasure.